going to help to try to do the job with two people. So let me introduce Larry Kivett. He is here to talk about fraud in the supply chain. He is a forensic partner with Deloitte. I'm sure most of you have heard of Deloitte. He's out of the Houston office. And he primarily focuses on delivering a variety of forensic investigations, consulting, forensic accounting, litigation, all that good fun stuff that we all like so much, related to supply chain forensics. And of course, many of us have been around the industry long enough to know that years ago we didn't even talk about forensics within supply chain, and today it's a pretty common, normal thing. I think you guys actually have a full-scale forensic unit now, don't you, at your company? Yeah, and it seems to be up and coming and growing. So it's a subject that for some, you're already there. For others, you're probably going to get there pretty soon, particularly as we continue to grow in e-commerce and also as we face some of these other demands that are out there. So with that, Larry, it's all yours.
Right. Thanks, Fred. Good morning. Randy did want to express his regrets for not being able to be here today. Unfortunately, the family matter occurred late yesterday afternoon, prevented him from attending today. But more than happy to be back in Dallas. I actually lived and worked in Dallas for about 12 years or so, and then 5 years ago decided that humidity was a wonderful thing and maybe I would just change climates and move south. So I've been in Houston for the last 5 years, focused on forensics at Deloitte. So most of my time is spent in the energy industry, the oil and gas space. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is really building off some of the themes that the last presentation touched on and focusing in around fraud, waste, and abuse. What does that mean for supply chain? Potentially, how do we prevent it? How do we detect fraud within supply chain? And what's the role of data analytics associated with that? But before I dive too deep into just the specific fraud angles on this, what overall is driving digital or data analytics in supply chain? And I don't think there's anything here that will necessarily be a surprise to anyone, but it's worth starting at kind of this wider lens before we get down into specific fraud use cases, which I'll touch on in a little bit. Clearly, from a data volume perspective, there's more information available today than there ever has been. That's not going to change. It's only going to exponentially grow. If we think about traditional supply chain information, from a forensics angle, that could be financial data, it's contract information, invoicing, billing support, that type of thing. But now there's a whole host of new data sets, be it geospatial, RFID driven, and the like, that can be informative. Cost reduction is always going to be of paramount concern within supply chain. How do you optimize costs? How do you drive costs out of the equation in order to enhance the bottom line? Regulations are only getting more complex as well. If you think about just environmental as one particular area, you've got compliance-related issues at the state and even the local level. You've got U.S. regulations, international regulations to deal with. And sometimes those things are not directly aligned, even can be in conflict with each other. And so how do you get your arms around that information set from a compliance perspective? And interestingly here, what we see too is regulators themselves are becoming more savvy, particularly as it relates to data analytics. They've got expectations as it relates to what organizational capabilities are on managing data, analyzing that data, and identifying trends. The SEC, for example, has got their own set of data scientists that look at all the financial information filings that come through, looking for potential fraud indicators. So it's an example of a regulator that's using data analytics to analyze their own information sets. And the DOJ and SEC combined around things like FCPA cases are oftentimes asking questions around data analytics and how within your third-party relationships were you mining information in order to understand what the risk priorities are. And then from this, how do you get to hidden insight? There's just too much information for individuals to be able to wrap their minds around. So how can you use and leverage technologies in order to be able to identify patterns that may not necessarily be visible, but then to prioritize those and really be able to have an analyst, the person, take a look at that information and be able to dig into it and determine whether or not there's a particular problem. So when we think about data analytics within supply chain, again, we'll focus mostly on fraud today, but I wanted to touch on some of the other areas as well. because data analytics touches on any number of things. It could be predictive maintenance around capital equipment. When do repairs need to be made in order to prevent a potential safety issue? Within the food industry, what's the distribution look like? Where are there potential anomalies or gaps that would identify contamination or potential problems? And what goes into restaurants or into grocery stores as examples. Third-party due diligence is an area that I spend a lot of time in. And traditional due diligence was kind of a one-time background check, and then continuing to look to see if the third parties you're interacting with happen to appear on a sanctions list, as an example. And we're seeing a real shift there towards more continuous monitoring and enhanced due diligence. So how do you stay on top of, instead of just a one-time snapshot or view of a third-party vendor, how do you continue to get data and information around what their activities are? And that could be through news outlets, it could be through social media, kind of that sentiment analysis as it relates to early warning indicators. From a contracts perspective, be it robotics process automation, natural language processing, there's significant changes that are going on there from a legal perspective. A lot of in-house legal teams are looking at using smart contracts to get more standardized information and clauses across the organization. So a simple example, again, just looking at FCPA, is you've had an evergreen contract that's been in place for multiple years. The information, the legal language around FCPA and anti-corruption compliance is outdated. Does that play into then a risk prioritization that says this is a contract that needs to be renegotiated, not just strictly for commercial terms, but for reasons driven more from a legal and compliance perspective? And then regulatory compliance. Financial services industry is pretty advanced here, actually. You think about anti-money laundering and know your customer types of requirements. There's a lot of data analytics that are applied to those particular areas in order to be able to demonstrate to the government, to regulators, that the institution has knowledge as to who they're conducting business with and that they're preventing money laundering from a compliance perspective. So shifting to think about fraud specifically, this fraud risk management maturity model is kind of an easy conversation starter with our clients around their anti-fraud programs and controls. Where are they at as it relates to a maturity model? And I would say, in my experience, most of my clients are somewhere within that basic to foundational kind of a maturity model. Yes, fraud risks exist. They're aware that there are fraud risks. Maybe they even do some limited data analytics to be able to identify those. Perhaps they do an enterprise-wide fraud risk assessment to identify what the schemes that may exist that they could be impacted by. But it's not necessarily on a continuous, ongoing perspective. And interestingly, from a supply chain angle, most often we don't see a lot of data analytics that are directly related to fraud being applied, either by the supply chain team or by internal audit or an investigative group on a proactive basis. And so that tends to keep them more in kind of this basic to foundational area. Although we do see a lot of interest as people are looking to leverage data and information, how do they move further along that curve in order to potentially prevent fraud from occurring? So what are some of the analytical areas where fraud and compliance analytics apply? There's a number of them that are listed on here. The use cases that I'll get into in a few minutes will really touch on a lot of these. One that's interesting, just more from a kind of a traditional, easier approach, is P cards and employee expense reimbursements. It's still somewhat surprising that a lot of organizations don't really do much in the way of data analytics around their employee expenses. I recently worked on a project with a client where pretty good sized publicly traded company, and they had never really looked at employee reimbursements. They had a high degree of trust in their employee base. There was a kind of a cultural construct around that trust, perhaps naively so, unfortunately. But in any event, we worked with them to look at employee expense information over a several year period. And one of the simple things that we did was just run a word cloud around the expense information that had been submitted. The word clouds, if you're not familiar with them, it's kind of the graphic of how frequently do particular terms show up within a population of data. and how does that look like within a cloud kind of a format. Interestingly, for this company, Amazon was a term that came up with a high degree of regularity, and that set off some alarm bells within their organization of why are we procuring, or why are our employees procuring so much from Amazon, and why are we reimbursing for that? And as we dug into the information more, yeah, we identified some limited instances of fraud. I mean, there were some easy things that stood out, jewelry that had been purchased and things like that that people had run through. But more interestingly, there were a lot of very legitimate business purchases that were being made. People were using their Prime accounts in order to order office supplies and small amounts of IT equipment and things like that, because their notion was that through Prime, they could get the deliveries faster into their work environment than they could by using the standard IT or office supply provider that the company had under contract. So there were certainly some limited instances of fraud, but what it really highlighted to the company was we're not enforcing the procurement policies that we have in place. Our employees aren't educated around the supply chain providers that we have negotiated contracts with. And frankly, for them, the company was losing money because they were missing out on volume discounts and things like that that they had built into these contracts, anticipating that the volume would be more than it was, and they were just being bypassed by their employee base. And so they put into place some new programs and controls, including training for their employee base as to what was appropriate and how to procure those types of items. So I'll go through 4 different use cases, talk about how data analytics play into fraud, waste, and abuse in several of these examples. I mentioned I'm from Houston, so these industry cases are really focused on the energy and often the oil and gas industry. That said, the fraud schemes themselves are really industry agnostic. It doesn't matter whether you're a commerce company, if you're in distribution business, retail, whatever it happens to be. These types of fraud schemes can happen anywhere, and unfortunately, what we've seen, and I think what you heard from the last panel as well, is, look, fraud can happen to any company, and in fact, probably is happening. It's just a question of whether or not it's identified yet, or to what scale it happens to be occurring at. So this first scenario or use case came about because a warehouse employee, so a lower level employee, but somebody out on the front lines, noticed that within the warehouse space that they operated within, there were a large number of coveralls that were being built up. They had a huge inventory of these things in crates. It was taking up space. They actually didn't have room for other inventory that was being ordered in, and they just didn't see that these coveralls were really being that highly utilized by the employees and the line workers. So the individual just raised a concern to management, basically a complaint that just says, look, why do we keep getting this stuff? I don't have the room for it. I don't want them anymore. Why do we keep getting these things to arrive? And it's actually, I should probably pause here for a minute on this because I think it's an important point. The Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, so this is the ACFE for forensic accountants and professionals in my line of work, is kind of the industry trade association. They actually publish a report, every other year around fraud trends and what they see out of investigations, what they see as potential fraud schemes and risks on a global basis. That report gets published, like I said, every other year. They've been doing it now for about 30 years or so. It's good reading. I'd actually, if you're not familiar with the organization or haven't seen the report, I'd encourage you to go to their website. I believe it's acfe.org, if I remember correctly. That report is freely available. There's no cost to it. It's just a PDF download, but it's got a lot of good information in there around potential fraud schemes and risks. One thing that has been consistent over the 30-year period of their report is that the vast majority of frauds are identified by employees and reported through helplines, through tip lines, be it a call-in number or a website, or just even a direct report to a manager of a particular concern. And far and away, most of frauds are initially identified by employees. And so as supply chain leaders, and I won't ask anyone to raise their hands, but I'd ask you, When was the last time that you thought about what the fraud risks or the fraud schemes are within your particular business's supply chain? When was the last time you had a conversation with your managers or your direct reports around what those fraud schemes or risks might be? When was the last time that those managers had discussions with their team members? And how does that information trickle down? Can't stress how critical it is to have that ongoing dialogue. One, fraud can occur. We all know that it can occur. So if it's not top of mind or at least not discussed with some regularity, it's being ignored. And that just puts you at even greater risk. The other thing that I think is important associated with that is if you're having the conversations and as a leader you're directing those conversations, it shows that you're open to having those discussions. And that really helps with then people being comfortable in raising any concerns that they may have. In the energy industry, from a safety perspective, there's this notion of if you see something, say something. Very much applies to fraud as well. If someone has a concern, they need to feel comfortable in order to be able to raise that. And having those kinds of ongoing dialogues, I think, help to supplement those conversations and really support people being comfortable and coming forward. So back to this particular use case, like I said, this was an instance where a warehouse employee identified what the issue was. That then opened up an internal investigation where it was determined that there was a buyer that had responsibility for purchasing these coveralls as well as other materials. And they had an inappropriate relationship with a third-party vendor. They were accepting kickbacks and bribes in order to place larger quantities of orders in order to buy things at a higher price. The individual was getting cash payments, they were getting free trips, a car, kind of a variety of different incentives in order to induce this behavior. Interestingly enough, after looking at this particular buyer, and there was a decision made to terminate this individual, as the person was walking out the door, they said, fine, you got me. I have no idea why you're just looking at me. Everybody else that's my peer in this buying organization is doing the exact same thing. And went out the door. That obviously set off a lot of alarms and caused management to pause and say, well, is this just a disgruntled worker kind of with their parting shot out the door, or is there really anything to this or not? We came in to assist and helped out initially by looking at their internal investigation, which had largely been kind of interview and email driven and that type of thing. We wanted to get an understanding of really what the patterns of behavior were that this buyer was exhibiting. So we looked at some data from about a 2-year period of purchasing behavior, not just for that person, but for others, because now we've got this broader umbrella of risk because of his comments as he was leaving. And we broke things down around the volume of transactions, the volume of orders, quantities that were ordered, the dollar amounts involved, what did that look like on a per order basis. And what's highlighted here is that suspicious employee. You can kind of see some spikes at different points in time associated with him, but in particular in this one 3 to 6 month period. And how did that correlate to others? Because we see certainly some other suspicious spikes from buyers that exhibited potentially similar types of patterns. We dug a little bit deeper and really kind of approached it from what was this fraudster's digital fingerprint? What were they doing in order to game the system, in order to be able to derive benefit, in particular the kickback and bribery scheme that they had engaged in? And there were 4 main factors. There were price increases. So we saw price overrides within the system that weren't explainable. We saw continually increasing prices that were being approved for certain purchases. We saw a lot of same-day orders, so multiple orders from the same vendor for the same types of materials on the exact same day. From a purchase requisition perspective, as those came in to this buyer, we saw him splitting these up into multiple transactions, which frankly just complicated things for him. It made no sense to do a split on it. But he was doing that in order to, in essence, try and cover it up and make things less obvious, particularly as it related to some of the pricing increases that he was engaged in. And then just skirting approval, so kind of that standard issuing purchase orders for amounts that were slightly below approval thresholds in order to keep things close, not require a lot of additional management oversight or approvals. And so we had this fingerprint for this individual. And by the way, at this point, it was identified that, the coveralls issue that got identified in the warehouse was really only kind of a small portion of this. The person was terminated because of the coveralls. That's internally would have been identified at that particular point in time. But this analysis over a 2-year period actually identified this type of behavior he was doing across multiple vendors, multiple materials purchases, and the like. And so even for him, it was a much larger issue than was initially thought. But taking that fingerprint, given that he's now walked out the door and said, hey, everybody else is doing this. Again, is it just somebody, disgruntled and taking that parting shot? Was there some truth to it? Unknown at that point. There were no other specific allegations or other information to implicate any of the other buyers. And so what we did from leveraging data analytics was use his fingerprint, his characteristics, and apply it to the broader purchasing population. Through that, we identified about half a dozen or so buyers that had some of the same characteristics. Again, going back to those, we see these same types of spikes or behaviors where they're splitting requisitions, they're coming in right below PO approval levels, and the like. Out of those 6, there was one that particularly stood out. And this person was then individually investigated and ultimately terminated for taking kickbacks and bribes from another set of vendors, totally outside of who had been looked at initially. What's interesting here is that digital fingerprint held in all aspects. This individual had one additional characteristic. He was holding purchase requisitions open. So he had figured out that within the system there was not an automatic closeout of a purchase requisition. He could keep one requisition open and then just continue to refer back to that number for fictitious orders and for inflated orders to be applied to future use. And so that was partly how he was driving then the dollar amounts that were coming back to him in the form of bribes and kickbacks. But what stands out about this is this buyer B, the second individual, there was no indication of concern around that person whatsoever at the beginning of this. It was only through leveraging the data analytics and that pattern that otherwise wouldn't have been able to have been detectable that this individual was caught and the fraud was stopped. Interestingly, there was also a side issue in this particular investigation, and here we leveraged natural language processing. There was some concern that had come up through interviews and then through the data analysis that the buyers may be actually coding purchases to the inappropriate materials grouping. And so we looked across the population of data. We used natural language processing to look for some correlation factors. So for instance, if you look at, like gasket, which was showing up as purchasing description, it was highly correlated to engines from a materials grouping coding perspective. Not surprising, right? This was kind of things that were related to repairs from an engine perspective. And so it had a very high, what we call closeness score. In other instances, some unusual purchases were identified, like an electric guitar that showed up under engineering and industrial supplies. Potentially personal purchase, but that was kind of a one-time type of thing. Of more interest, we saw a number of references to cigarettes that were showing up under office supplies and miscellaneous operational supplies. When we raised this with management, they said, yeah, actually, kind of oddly enough, as an employee perk or gift for certain of our international locations, we purchase cigarettes and distribute those out to employees. We said, well, how much do you spend a year on that? Like 10 to 15,000, and it's only a couple of locations. Okay. So we went back to the data, and we actually showed them very quickly. So you're spending $800,000 a year on cigarettes. That raised their eyebrows. And then we said, look, not only are some of these purchases, you're not buying these by the carton, there's purchases by the truckload. And then as you dig into it and do some of the site investigation work, it was those trucks were not slowing down as they passed the facility to stop and drop off the cigarettes. It was, they were going right on by, and these things were being sold on the black market. And there was a ring of employees that were taking the money associated with that. So that was a set of issues. Now, the side issue, and actually what ultimately became even kind of more of a concern than the dollar amounts, is some of these cigarettes were being gifted to security personnel. These security personnel that, you know, had the night watch and things like that, the gifts or the cigarettes were there to keep them alert, keep them awake throughout the course of the night. But those individuals were not employees of the company. They were actually employees of a government agency. So now, inadvertently, there's a potential FCPA issue because you're giving gifts, sort of regardless of whatever the dollar amount is, to a government official, and then you have to go into consideration around, is that something that requires self-reporting, or how do we deal with that? So again, this one stands out because there was nothing at the front end of this to indicate any kind of concerns around cigarettes. It was just the power of the data analytics in order to be able to identify a potential issue that any single person would not have been able to gather out of the data itself. Next example is related to some shipping analytics. And so in this instance, our client had a long-standing relationship with a shipping company that they used on a global basis. They'd identified some unusual price increases and cost increase trends when their volumes really hadn't changed. They'd never audited this third party. They had a very good contract with them with audit rights. And like I said, it had been a long-standing relationship, but they had never exercised those audit rights. So we assisted and just looked at 3 months of data using information the company had in hand. So it was the contract, their invoices that they had received from the third party, the billing support that was behind those invoices, and ran some data analytics against that, again, kind of using natural language processing tools, also some more traditional rules-based tools that we've got in a library and that we tailored in order to be able to make sense with the contract itself. And the point on the audit notice is this analysis was done without ever contacting the third party, at least at that particular point in time. It was just working strictly off information that was currently available at hand. And we identified a variety of different issues. Actually, for the 3 months we looked at, there was in total around $6.5 million of questionable payments that were made. Covered a number of different issues. We did see, and this is where some of the geospatial information gets interesting, multiple instances of billings for ships that were located in 2 ports at the exact same time. And those ports being, you know, hundreds of miles apart from each other. So, is it fraud? At that point, not sure. Could have been billing error. Those things happen. But given that we saw multiple instances of it, there was kind of a pattern there, it certainly raised a lot of concerns. And in that instance, the company actually issued an audit notification letter and then opened up their own separate process around that in order to be able to analyze both the historical period that went farther back as well as some other potential areas of concern beyond just kind of these one-off instances of the ships being in multiple ports. Next is somewhat similar around vendor invoice analytics. This is related to a large capital project for an oil and gas company in North America. Here we were really focused in around labor. So interestingly enough, they had a very highly manual process. Invoices would come in from a general contractor. They had a couple of staff accountants that would basically take the invoicing information. And to their credit, from a monitoring perspective, they were trying to do some limited testing on a line item basis and really compare labor rates to the contract rates. But it was a bit of a needle in a haystack because just the volume was very significant. They had to get this turned around very quickly. They were trying to do their testing before they actually paid the amounts out, which is a leading practice. But again, it was so limited from a controls perspective, it was a little bit more of kind of a feel-good control than I would say a real substantial or substantive control. We leveraged optical character recognition because a lot of these invoices some were hard copies, some were PDF. There was a lot of unstructured data, which made data analytics initially difficult. OCR by no means is a panacea. It's not perfect, but it at least got the information into a digital format in order to be able to drive some of the testing. And then we also had like spreadsheets and things like that from an invoicing perspective. One of the complications here was it was a general contractor and then about 15 union labor agreements underneath that, which kind of spoke to the complexity of their manual process and trying to test against all of those individual contracts and look for any potential anomalies. But we gathered that data together over about a 6-month period and initially just presented them with a simple dashboard. This was developed originally in Tableau. No secret sauce to it. It wasn't that difficult to actually pull together, but they had never looked at the data at a high level like this. Their accounting team was focused kind of in the weeds and the details of, is this invoice right for this one particular 2-week period? And then they would move on to the invoice for the next 2-week period without ever really stepping back and looking at the broader picture. In fact, the track against budget, it was kind of the series of complex Excel spreadsheets that they were manually keying in what their actual amounts incurred were relative to what the budget was. And here we were able to point out, just from a dashboarding perspective, fairly quickly where they were off against budget based on areas that were surprising to them they didn't expect. And a lot of it was just kind of the manual error or some timing differences when they were able to get invoice data input. So at this point, not anything directly from a fraud concern, but just how do you improve overall project controls? Now, as we dug into the data, we did see some potential fraud concerns. And the example here is, like I said, a lot of this was labor-driven. There were materials costs, but probably 80% of the cost for the project were labor, so we focused on that. The test here, or what this is showing, is overtime outliers. So we looked at this along kind of a whole host of different parameters and dimensions, overtime just being one. But this is where the power of visualization and showing data tells a much better story than if you just saw things in an Excel spreadsheet that were differences. So there's a variety of different things that are going on here. There's the 4 quadrants. What you see up here on the upper right is high overtime hours, or a high number of overtime hours incurred, and high overtime rates. And this is in comparison to the population as a whole. We also did comparisons against like budget expectations and productivity factors and that type of thing. But for purposes of this, it was, how does this particular labor class look relative to the other labor classes? And where do some things stand out? So for instance, and then we ran a variety of different rules tests in order to determine whether or not there are any potential failures. So a rule might be, for instance, did overtime hours exceed 50% of standard labor hours during that 2-week period? Were there multiple rates that an individual billed for that particular period? Did one individual get billed at different labor levels or different responsibility areas during that particular time frame and the like? And that was all based on what we saw within the contracts, and then from our own experience, what we felt like some of the potential risk factors might be. So what you see here, although it's kind of hard to read because it's so small, is these were 17 of the tests that this particular labor class failed, which was a scaffolder. So scaffolder class A. That particular labor grouping had 40,000 hours, and it was comprised of about 100 different employees. And it's actually kind of this orangish red circle up here. The larger the circle, the more man hours are included within that particular labor grouping. And then the gradient, or the color, is indicative of the number of tests that they failed. So something that's in green, they failed a fairly low number of tests. At 17, this was really kind of up in that orange-red. So we focused on what was high degree of overtime hours, high rate, and then what were the risks that we saw from the testing. And through that analysis, identified fairly quickly about $1.5 billion of potential labor-related fraud issues. Kind of the standard thing. Duplicate billings for one individual. A lot of instances where one person was being charged at multiple rates within the 3-month time period without there really being a change in their job responsibilities or anything like that. And then there was another $3 million or so that was questionable, but have to go to the actual general contractor in order to get additional information to further vet those out. But what I like about this is just being able to demonstrate how visualizing information shows you what your risks are. There's no way that the staff accountants at this company could have gone through, or even a team of forensic accountants for that matter, could have gone through Excel spreadsheets and tied all of this together and been able to present it. You really needed the power of the technology in order to be able to sort through that information, extract out and summarize it, and then where the person comes in is looking at this type of a graphic and saying, here are the potential risk areas, and here's where we need to drill in further. So the last use case is really around inventory and cycle count analysis. This was a company that had some potential concerns. They weren't sure, but had some concerns as it related to accuracy of their inventory, mainly driven off the fact that they would do an inventory, they would get the results back, everything looked fine, and then fairly quickly after that, they would run into stock shortages that were unexplained. They would run into unexplained write-offs of inventory that made no sense. And interestingly enough, and this had been a long-standing kind of policy, they paid bonuses to their inventory managers when their inventory counts came in accurate. Well, that, Murphy's Law, right? Kind of the law of unintended consequences. What they were trying to drive was not that the numbers matched. What they were trying to drive was that an accurate count was done. But the bonus was paid on amounts matched. So it incented people to basically override the system or to misreport information in order to obtain the bonus, which then caused all of the problems that they saw later on down the road. And through data analytics, we were able to demonstrate that we used materials management system information, we used their inventory count data, and some other information around like write-offs and obsolescence and that type of thing. We were able to demonstrate and confirm that, yeah, actually a lot of this is driven by that bonus paying policy. And in fact, here's kind of what the real state of the inventory looks like, what the spikes were, the valleys were as it related to some of the behaviors that those types of things were driving. So they changed the policy. That was good. And really focused in on look, we want accuracy of count, even if that means that there's a difference with the information that's in the system. And then they saw pretty significant improvements after that. So I think this is a good example of not necessarily fraud per se. Fraud certainly from like the individual level. They had the employee issue of people misstating the information, and they had to deal with that. But it was what is our policy driving that is unintended when we really are trying to get to accurate information. So at the front end, I talked about the various areas the data analytics can support supply chain fraud, really only being one of those. And there's ROI, not just from a fraud perspective. Obviously, every dollar of fraud that you prevent drops straight to the bottom line. That can be tough to measure, though. If you get asked the question of, well, how much fraud did you prevent today? I don't have a good number to just point to, right? But ROI can apply to a variety of different areas. It could be cost recovery. So the use case from a shipping perspective where I talked about that, and there were certainly elements of fraud associated with it, but there was also just better management practice and analysis of those shipping costs and what was reasonable in order to provide savings and drive down costs there. Same thing from a strategic sourcing perspective. If you go back to the P-card example that I gave, employees were using Amazon basically because they thought it was simpler, easier, faster than what the standard procurement channel was. And they needed to re-educate the customer base or their employee base around that. And then they were able to recover volume discounts and things like that going forward as they got better control around those procurement processes. Continuous monitoring, getting back to the due diligence example, just having better information around third parties and who you're interacting with. Too often we see companies that do due diligence once and then 5 years passed and they have a problem with the vendor. They let them in the door, but they never continue to follow up or stay on top of what some of the potential risk areas and risk factors are there. The bottom one, internal audit. This is interesting. I spend a lot of time with heads of internal audit and directors of internal audit. They are looking to leverage data analytics as well. Frankly, a lot of times they're chasing the business to try and keep up with how to apply data analytics. Not just strictly from a compliance sense, but from an operational sense as well. Internal audit has a lot of very good knowledge and information around business processes as a whole across the company, not just strictly within supply chain, but seeing more efforts to team with operational areas of the business around data analytics in order to be able to decipher and obtain more information that's beneficial and, again, drive ROI. So it's not just strictly a compliance check, but an overall business improvement type of analysis. So the question always comes up, well, how do we take action? Where do we start with data analytics? And I think a couple of key ideas here are technology is not the place to start. It's what's the business issue or the risk that you're trying to address, and then figure out what the technology is that can potentially help with that. Start small. Figure out what that risk area is or the business issue is. Pilot. Enhance the pilot. Reiterate. Move on to the next one. This isn't like a big platform of take technology and plunk it in and then we'll do these thousands of different things. That approach can be tried. Haven't seen a lot of success with it. It's really more around what's that particular risk issue you're trying to address and then identify where the technology slides in underneath that. Because technology itself is not a silver bullet. I'm a big proponent of data analytics. If I look at my profession, data analytics is transforming the way that we perform investigations. It's transforming who we hire from a forensics perspective. Back not that many years ago, a lot of the folks that we hired out of college were people like me, accounting background, CPA, perhaps former auditors. Now we're hiring a lot of the same folks that cyber is chasing. It's those STEM students. It's the engineering, software coders, and the like. Because data analytics is really, from a forensics perspective, kind of the wave of the future, I think, around not just detection, but around prevention. Fraud detection, remember, means that the fraud has already occurred. Those dollars are out the door and likely not to be recovered. So it's really around the risk mitigation and fraud prevention. How do you stop it from occurring in the first place? And then you're left with the conundrum of how do you measure the ROI around prevention? But with that, I think I'll go ahead and close. Happy to answer any questions that anyone may have. I guess in closing, the one thing I would go back to is I got on my soapbox a little bit earlier about educating and informing the employee base. I honestly can't stress that enough around fraud risks. They're your first line of defense. So they need to be aware of what fraud risks are. If they identify potential issues, they need to be comfortable in raising their voice associated with that. And frankly, they need to know where to go to raise their voice. So that's education around the helpline, around being able to report to a direct manager and the like, because it takes a lot of courage for somebody to step forward and raise a concern when maybe they don't have all of the facts or the information, they don't want to be wrong. But that needs to be taken seriously, and particularly from a supply chain perspective, whether it's the warehouse employee that sees a bunch of pallets stacking up or somebody that's got direct line relationships with a third-party vendor. There are multiple entry points for fraud to occur, and just making sure that your people are aware of that and feel empowered to come forward, I think, is critical. with that, I'm happy to answer any questions. Yes? Yeah.
Ramifications for the vendor afterwards.
On that first use case?
Yes.
Hey, Larry,
Okay, so I'll repeat the questions and make sure I get this right because it was kind of a separate two-parter. The first one is, in my experience, do most companies offer a reward for helpline submission? There's a lot of debate around that. I would actually say, in my experience, most companies do not offer a reward. There are certainly companies that I've worked with and I'm aware of that do. And I think a lot of it just kind of comes down to sort of historical legacy and cultural decision. The arguments for providing a reward are incenting people, obviously, to come forward, financially incenting. The arguments against that are largely, as a culture, we want people to feel empowered to come forward because they've got a fiduciary obligation to the company to do that. And so it's more of kind of a ethical, moral argument around not providing that financial incentive. I've seen success with both models, frankly. But I would say, in my experience, the majority of companies don't offer a financial incentive. And then your second question was, in the first use case, who came? So the question is in the first use case with that procurement individual or the buyer that was getting the kickbacks, who kind of initiated the relationship? Was it the vendor that developed the scheme? Was it the employee that developed the scheme? And then what were the ramifications for the vendor? Not 100% clear on who initiated. Was it the employee or was it the vendor? This was a relationship that had developed over time and had developed outside of the workplace, so they were close personal friends. So who was the seed of the idea? Not determined. Nobody came forward to actually say, yeah, I was the one that initiated this. Ramifications for the vendor, they were cut off, terminated. And then my recollection is anything that was owed to them from an outstanding balance never was paid. That was a drop in the bucket relative to what the actual kickbacks in the scheme were over the course of time. But given the money was already out the door, and the company did get supplies and materials, they got way too much of certain things and they way overpaid for certain things, but it wasn't like these were all fictitious transactions either. Other questions? Yeah.
The multiple companies, some with comprehensive accounting programs, some with comprehensive accounting programs, loss prevention programs, 800 lines, and other companies that may not have that level. Do you see internal fraud happening almost equal across the board, or is it more prevalent in companies that have more stricter controls?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So did everybody hear that? Okay. Helplines are a communications channel. Now, 80% of what comes through a helpline or even higher, is not fraud related, right? It's somebody complaining about their boss not being nice to them and, kind of other HR related matters, right? So you have to take the good with the bad kind of when it comes to some of the helplines. It's not to downplay the HR issues, because those still need to be looked at and are important from a cultural perspective. But, from a purely fraud perspective, you don't generally see a huge volume come through, which is why when you see them, they need to really be dealt with. What's less known of is, for those companies that don't have like a helpline, or they don't have, chief ethics or compliance officer, they don't have an investigations group. Those tend to be smaller organizations. Are they susceptible to fraud? Certainly. Does fraud occur to them? Yes. Is it at the same scale or a greater degree of frequency because they don't have those controls in place? I'd say that's a bit more muddied and kind of less clear to be able to determine. That said, for a decently sized public organization or even a private one, having those types of mechanisms in place, maybe not a dedicated investigations team because there might not be that much volume of activity, but certainly having a code of conduct for your employees, having a code of conduct for your suppliers, having training around what your expectations are from a compliance perspective, having an internal audit function that is the third line of defense to help oversee things. Those are all critical factors to not just to help prevent and detect fraud, but really deal with kind of a whole series of other operational concerns and risk areas as well. Yes.
More a comment, but I thought your presentation was terrific and it's right on point.
Thank you.
Live safe. I'm sorry, this is a little bit of a pitch, but what we do is we take the see something, say something, and add the do something part to that.
Yeah.
And what we've seen is that people sometimes are intimidated about coming forward about, I'm looking at Byron and I think he might be doing something, but I'm intimidated, I don't want to say anything, or I'm seeing somebody being harassed in the office. So we provide even an anonymous way of providing those tips in. And it also, our platform takes out the guessing of where those tips need to go. So if it's fraud, it can actually go directly to somebody in supply or somebody in security. There's a lot of great points that you bring up, and in the U.S. alone, we can't actually get these numbers for Europe and Asia, but in the U.S. alone, there's over $300 billion spent on things like fraud and malfeasance and sexual harassment each year by companies across the board. Any industry, any vertical that you want to look at. But I thought you had a lot of terrific points. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. And that, you mentioned intimidation. There's just the human nature element of this too, which is coworkers don't want to think bad things about their fellow coworkers. I mean, there's that culture of trust, which frankly we need in order to make capitalism work, but it can also work against us. There's kind of this notion of the 80-10-10 rule, which says, 80% of people are generally good and will adhere to ethical and moral values. 10% of people are more situational. They're generally good, but given the right opportunity or particular situation, they'll make some bad decisions and potentially could commit fraud. And then 10% of people are amoral, sociopaths, whatever you want to call it, and will always game the system to their favor and will take advantage of anybody that they possibly can in order to put themselves ahead. So statistically, if you do that math, look around the room, figure out who's to your right, who's to your left, classify them. No, don't do that. But it points out the fact that, look, these, human nature also includes the desire, the ability to do bad things. And so that's really where fraud can occur to any company, regardless of size or industry or anything like that. Yes?
Can you go back to
Uh-huh.
what are some of the common applications of that in a supply chain investigation? Is it just looking at invoices?
Yeah, so there's a variety of different applications where you can use natural language processing. Frankly, not even so much from a fraud perspective, but like around contracts. So if you've got a large body of homogeneous contracts, what is the language that is within those? So for instance, right now, from an accounting perspective, not to get too geeked out on kind of accounting technical matters, but there were some new FASB regulations around leases and revenue recognition that impacted pretty much every company within the U.S. Around how do they treat operational leases, as what do they report in their SEC filings and things like that. For certain companies, they had thousands of contracts that made up the corpus of information that they needed to be able to review and determine what the financial impact of this would be. So natural language processing's played a huge role in just trying to get arms around what is that information. And so it's using some artificial intelligence, some enhanced analytics in order to look at a small population of those contract documents and identify, look, here's the standard language that we would expect to see across the entire body. Now technology, go out and find that, extract it, bring it back, and then do the correlation factors that I talked about, where here's what we expect, and then here's the correlation. It's either highly correlated or we've got some outliers that are really way off, and we've got to dig into those documents in order to understand what the financial ramifications are. So I think that's a good example of one that's not strictly fraud related, but definitely plays into not just supply chain, but value chain, because it'd be contracts with customers and things like that as well. I think there was a question, in the back.
So my question is,
From a consumer fraud perspective, and maybe generally speaking, as it relates to e-commerce and consumer fraud, has your organization done any analytics on consumers that claim non-receipt of shipments, or have any other schemes set up, or is that even something that you guys have had some of your customer base approaching with problem scenarios?
Yeah, so kind of two parts to that question. Have we published anything? I would honestly have to go and take a look. Kind of commerce and retail is not an area that I personally spend a lot of time in. I suspect that we probably have. Certainly, if you looked at Deloitte.com and just did a quick search around some of that, probably that information would come up. And if you give me your card, I'm happy to take a look and see what I can find for you too. As it relates to investigation, yeah, absolutely. Non-receipt of goods, even around things like reverse logistics supply chain, as you're taking, mobile phones was kind of a case study earlier. If you take those handsets in from a telecommunications carrier and they're going back overseas, or they're being dealt with from like a repair and maintenance perspective, what are some of the fraud schemes and risk areas there? I've personally dealt with that and touched on that. At the actual consumer level, like Amazon dropping a package off at your door and it not being there, I doubt it, but wouldn't shock me if we've done some work there. What else? Yes, sir.
in a variety of areas, they deal with false positives to make sure that your data isn't skewed going down the wrong.
Right. Yeah. So false positives, for those that may not know, so if you run data analytics and you may have some predetermined ideas as to what the risk factors are, that thing kicks out results. You take a look at those and you determine that it was a false positive. In essence, a red flag was raised when in fact there wasn't one with the transaction. The machine learning plays into that. So it's an iterative process. You may start off with a base set of assumptions around what the risks are, run a test, it kicks out a set of transactions. You don't run it against the entire population at the front end because you don't want 5,000 hits that then you have to sort through, right? It's kind of like the pilot approach where starting small is almost always better. Look at a limited set of transactions. If you've particularly got some theories up front as to what the risk areas are, test against that. Look at the results that kick out of that. For those that are false positives, why were they false positive? That can then inform we need to tweak this particular variable, or there was a variable that we didn't think about that needs to be added into the learning model going forward, and then reiterate. And you just kind of continually whittle down and narrow down from there to identify those that are truly critical. But you're right, it's where I've seen data analytics fail in the past, and I think kind of collectively companies and industries getting better about this, is throw a test out there, see what sticks, it kicks up 5,000 results, and everybody goes, oh my God, how could we possibly have that many, fraud transactions? Well, you probably don't. It's just there's some default or defect in the logic that was initially applied to it.
All right, Larry, thank you very much.
Great,
Appreciate
thank
it.
you.
So, but anyway, I appreciate it.